Now switching over to the Premier League, and we are at the halfway point of the Premier League's league phase. We've had 8 weeks of the season so far, but how would you rate the season, and has this new format run its course?
I think give it another 8 weeks and this new format will have run its course, but I think it made sense to bring it back for a second year. I still think there is some intrigue in it, but it does get a little dry because you're seeing the same matches over and over again. And I'm not writing Peter Wright off quite yet, but I'm getting pretty darn close to. And maybe soon we'll be saying the same thing about Johnny Clayton. And we're going to end up in a situation where we're having 16 weeks, half of those weeks, 2 of the players already out of it. And that does happen. Even when we had relegation, it was very often that one of the players survived, but a week or 2 after survival, they had nothing much to play for. But this can become a real long drag. And if you're already basically out of it at the halfway stage and knowing you still have another 8 weeks to go, that's going to make it really tough to play through, and it can be really tough to watch as a result. I don't know if I'm going to say that it's ran its course yet. As I said, I think it made sense to come back for a second season, but I think I want to see them mix it up again next year, and I think I will be sick of this format by the end of it. That said, that's only half the question. The question is not just has this run its course, but also how do you rate the season so far? And so far, I do think the season's shaping up fairly well, especially in that middle of the table. MVG has been dominant, winning 3 nights in a row and having a chance to make it 4 in a row before he only went and got himself whitewashed. But now Gezzy's won back-to-back, and both of them have won 3 nights, and both of them look set for the playoffs. Not guaranteed. If Gezzy goes and loses a few quarterfinals, he can find himself on the outside looking in fairly quickly. His lead's not that big, but you don't expect that to happen. And even if that happens right now, you'd expect him to bounce back. He's ready to finally get to the playoffs. And once he gets to the playoffs, he's going to be ready to go on and win this thing. But it looks like at the top of the table, those 2 are set. But there's a really interesting dynamic in the middle. And I'll include Johnny Clayton in that middle because he's not that far back yet. But Nathan Aspinall, Michael Smith, right now they're in, but Chris Dobie's just defeated Michael Smith back-to-back weeks in the quarterfinals. Dimitri Vandenberg has split his matches against Nathan Aspinall. Johnny Clayton keeps getting himself close, but isn't winning quite yet. All of those 5 players have every chance, and there will be a lot for them to play for. And overall, they're playing at a fairly good standard. But the thing about playing 3 matches in a night potentially is that you are seeing more poor matches. You're seeing players have to go through 2 or 3 matches a night when in the past they would just have the one. And you've seen some times where they come back in that semifinal or the final is dry. I mean, yes, we talk about how good Gezzy's been, but we can also talk about just how terrible that semifinal with Chris Dobie was standard-wise. They both averaged in the mid-80s, and it looked like it. Nathan Aspinall has been flat in the semifinals 2 of the last 3 weeks. He got whitewashed by MVG when MVG played good but not great. And then, of course, he had the lowest average in Premier League history a few weeks ago with that 75 and change in Liverpool. So you're seeing some poor matches because players are having to come back on sometimes pretty quickly after playing and space themselves through a night while also having to keep their energy up knowing that a Euro Tour or a sometimes UK Open will be coming that upcoming weekend. It's led to, I think, some just less than stellar showings from players. And I think we might see even more of that as the season goes along. I think that gets us back to the first part. I think this will have run its course by the end of the year. It doesn't mean you can't come back to this again in a few years. I think having variety in the Premier League makes sense. And if there's a year where it really just seems that there are 8 players that deserve it and there's really not 2 others that you can shoehorn in, then in 2027, come back and do this format again. Having variety makes sense. But I think while there's a lot of intrigue, especially in that middle, there's a lot of repetitiveness and yeah. So, you know what? I've talked myself into saying, yes, it has already run its course. Let's move along.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think that's what a lot of our listeners are saying as well. This was our question of the week last week, and we thought we'd hold off on our thoughts until after the halfway point of the league phase, which was last Thursday in Newcastle. So 8 league nights down, 8 to go before the playoffs. And we gave our listeners 2 options the Andrew Gilding thumbs up or the thumbs down. And the result of the poll, 24% of our listeners going with thumbs up, 76% of our listeners going with thumbs down. And a lot of our listeners got in touch as well, tweeted us. Dan put, personally preferred the league format with draws than a straight knockout every week. Ben Locke said it's like watching a band do an arena tour and watching them play the same songs in the same order. It's brilliant at first, then gets a bit more boring every time you see it. Illegitim says, was quite positive about the new format from the start, but I drifted away by now. I think the Premier League as a whole is an outdated institution, doesn't quite fit anymore with the new age of darts. And one more from our listeners, Rob, saying better than last year, but I'm still not sold on the format. And my view personally, I said it on last week's show, I've hardly watched any of the Premier League so far this year. Last week, I managed to catch most of the first game between Michael van Gerwen and Peter Wright, then had one of the interviews with our guests that we had on the show, and after that I didn't turn it back on. I had a look at the results on Twitter later on and saw that I'd done pretty badly on the picks as usual. But as a format, I think the Premier League is much better suited to the audience at the moment in the venues, and I think you can see that with the crowd sticking around to the end. They're staying to watch the final and see who wins their night in their city or their local arena, wherever they're going to. And I think back to the last Premier League night that I went to, and that was early 2020 during the old format that we had, and you could see the arena was emptying out in the last game. Pints were being thrown around. There was a few fights breaking out as well. I know this is a very small sample size of the one night I went to as opposed to a whole season, but I think overall, looking at the current format, you're missing a bit of jeopardy at the midway point of the season. And usually this week, week 9, judgment night, we'd be discussing which players could be getting eliminated from the competition this week, whereas we know at the start all 8 players are going to be there up until week 16. So you touched on it there. You've got players like Peter Wright, not mathematically out of the race at the moment, but it's looking at a very tall order now for them to get into the playoffs. And when they say that every point matters, every game matters, it doesn't quite feel like that for me at the moment, because there are more points on offer each week. You've got not just 2 points they're playing for, you've got 3 if you make the final, 5 if you win the night. So at this stage of the season, as a darts fan, I'm not quite compelled to watch it. It's not must-watch TV for me. And that's not to say that the product itself isn't good. There's been some good games so far, and I'm sure the people in the venues and people watching are enjoying the darts as we recommend them to do each week. But I think once we get towards the end of the season, the race for the top 4 gets a bit closer towards the end now, and players are playing for those spots and they know what they've got to do to get in there. I think it's going to make for a much more interesting tournament to watch. But for the meantime, yeah, it is something that's not quite caught my imagination at the moment.